I was abandoned by my parents at 7 the day my brother was born. A janitor me crying outside and took me home. I worked 3 jobs to become chief of surgery and never looked back until an emergency patient arrived. And his blood chart had a handwritten note tapped to it. I read it and couldn't move. The night they left me, I remember the smell of the hospital more than anything else. Not the sharp antiseptic I would later learn to associate with purpose and precision, but something underneath it. Something that was coming from me. Fear has a smell when you are 7 years old. And the adults who were supposed to come back have not come back, and the sliding glass doors keep opening and closing for other people, and none of them are your parents. I had been sitting on the concrete bench outside Mercy General Hospital in Cincinnati for what felt like a very long time. I know now, from the police report that Carol eventually showed me years later, that it was closer to 2 hours. At 7, 2 hours without your parents feels like the beginning of forever. I had my backpack with me, because I had packed it myself that morning, the way I always packed it. Because my mother had not been doing the small domestic routines for the last few weeks of her pregnancy. The lunches, the homework checks, the reminders about library books. My father had been managing the house in the distracted way of a man whose attention was almost entirely on what was coming, and the neighbor Mrs. Patterson had been coming by in the afternoons to help, and somewhere in that arrangement, the care of me had become something that happened around the edges. I had made my own lunch that morning. A peanut butter sandwich on white bread, because the refrigerator had been mostly condiments, and the pantry had peanut butter. I had also packed my library book about horses, which was 2 weeks overdue, and a change of clothes, because my mother had told me that morning, in the rushed, distracted way. She had been talking for weeks, that I might need to stay somewhere else while the baby came. I had understood this to mean Mrs. Patterson's. I had understood wrong. My mother had gone into labor at 6 in the morning. My father had loaded her into the car and turned to me and said, with the expression of a man running on no sleep and high anxiety, that I should come with them for now and they would figure out the rest later. I had climbed into the back seat with my backpack because that was what I was told to do. At the hospital they had taken my mother inside quickly, and my father had said, "Wait here on this bench, we'll be right back." He had not been right back. I want to be clear about something before I go further. The story I am about to tell you is not a simple one, and the people in it are not simple people. I know that now, in a way. I could not have known at 7, sitting on a concrete bench, watching the sliding glass doors open and close. At 7 I understood only that I had been told to wait, and the person I was waiting for was not coming. And the sandwich in my backpack was gone, and the library book was sitting in my lap, and I was crying in the specific way that children cry when they are trying not to, which is worse than regular crying. Because it means you are already old enough to be ashamed of your own fear. The woman who sat down beside me had just finished a 12-hour shift. Her name was Carol Marsh, and she was 43 years old, and she was a floor nurse on the maternity ward. Which meant she had spent her day in the same building where my mother was delivering my brother, which is a coincidence that I have thought about many times, and that I no longer believe is only a coincidence. She had tired eyes, and a thermos, and the specific worn-down quality of someone who is holding a great deal together through the application of habit rather than actual energy. She looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then she sat down. "You waiting for someone?" she said. "My parents," I said. "They went inside." She looked at the doors. "How long ago?" I did not have a watch. I told her about counting the cars. She processed this, without making the face that adults sometimes made when children said things that were quietly heartbreaking. She just nodded. "What's your name?" "Sarah," I said. "Sarah Mitchell." She looked at me for another moment, then she said, "My car is in the lot. You want to come sit in it while you wait? You've been out here a while." I went with her. I know, as a physician and as an adult, that this was not a safe decision for a 7-year-old to make. I also know that when you are 7 and frightened, and the person offering safety is the first person who has sat down next to you in 2 hours and spoken to you like you are a person worth speaking to, the calculus of stranger danger does not function the way it is supposed to. I went with her because she had kind eyes and she did not make me feel like a problem. We sat in her car in the parking lot. She gave me the rest of her thermos, which was mostly milk and sugar with some coffee underneath it, and I held it with both hands and watched the hospital entrance, and she sat beside me and did not push. She did not ask me why my parents had not come back. She did not tell me everything was going to be fine. She just sat there, in the particular way of someone who has learned through experience that presence is sometimes the entire gift, and adding words to it makes it smaller. Carol Marsh was not a simple person. I want to tell you this clearly because the easy version of this story makes her purely good, a rescuing angel, and that is not who she was, and it would not honor her to describe her that way. She had been married to a man named Ray for 14 years, 11 of which he had been hurting her in ways that left marks she covered with long sleeves even in July. She had stayed because leaving had always felt more dangerous than staying, and because she was good at managing what was directly in front of her, and the larger shape of her life was something she had learned not to look at too directly. She took me home that night, partly because I needed somewhere to go, and she could see that clearly. She also took me home because she had spent 12 hours on a maternity ward watching families be made, and had driven home alone every night for 14 years, to an apartment where Ray's Masouds determined the atmosphere, and something about a small girl sitting alone on a bench in the dark had reached a place in her that had been quiet for a long time. I was not her salvation, and she was not mine. We were two people who needed something the other could provide, imperfectly, with complications, the way most real help works. Ray was in the apartment when we arrived. He looked at me, standing in the doorway, behind Carol, and he looked at Carol, and something moved across his face that I was too young to read correctly, but that I understand now, as a man calculating what this new variable meant for him. He did not hit her that night. He was quiet in the way of someone who is waiting to understand the situation before responding to it. That was the night I learned that Ray's quiet was its own kind of threatening, different from his loud but not less dangerous. He left 2 years later. I will not tell you. Carol's leaving was clean or simple because it was not. I will tell you that she left, which is the harder thing and the one that matters. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I am 42 years old, and I have been chief of surgery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago for the last 4 years. I built this life in the specific way that people build things when they understand that nobody is building it for them, which is one decision and one shift and one exam at a time, without looking too far ahead, because too far ahead is paralyzing, and the next thing in front of you is manageable. I worked at a diner on Clifton Avenue starting at 15. I added a grocery store job at 16. At 17, I was cleaning commercial offices 3 nights a week for cash. I did not have a social life in any way that would have been recognizable to my classmates. I had grades that got me into Ohio State on a full academic scholarship, and a work ethic that my professors described as relentless and that I thought of simply as necessary. I got through medical school. I matched into surgery at Northwestern. I moved to Chicago with 2 suitcases and a determination that I have never been able to fully separate from the memory of those 2 hours on a concrete bench, which is probably not a coincidence either. I had not thought about my parents in any active way for a long time. I had thought about them the way you think about a scar. Occasionally, when something pressed against it, and then moving on, because the pressing rarely produced anything useful. I had not looked for them. I had not hired anyone to look. I had built my life in the direction of forward and I had not turned around. Until 3 weeks ago at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, when an ambulance brought in a 68-year-old male with a cardiac event, and the charge nurse handed me the intake chart, and I opened it and found, taped to the inside cover, a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone completely soft. The handwriting was shaky. The ink was old. The first line said, "To whoever treats this patient, please find Dr. Sarah Mitchell at Northwestern Memorial. She needs to know who this man is before it is too late." I stopped moving. On the gurney in front of me was a man with my nose and my hands and my coloring, unconscious, with leads on his chest, an oxygen mask over his face, and 35 years of absence between us, that I had spent my entire adult life deciding did not matter. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are reading this from. I want to know who is out there with me tonight. I did not stop working. That is the thing people do not understand about surgery, or about the kind of person surgery selects for over years of training and residency, and the particular pressure of being responsible for a life that is actively failing in front of you. You do not stop. Whatever is happening in the part of you that is a person rather than a physician, the physician takes over, and the physician moves, and the person processes later, in the car or the shower, or the 3 a.m. darkness of an on-call room, but not here, not now, not while there is still something to do. I handed the note to the charge nurse without reading the rest of it, and I said, "Keep this. I'll come back to it." She looked at my face and did not ask questions, which is one of the things you learn to read in a good charge nurse. When to ask, and when to simply do what the surgeon says. I worked on him for 40 minutes. His name, according to the intake paperwork, was Robert Mitchell. He was 68. He had been brought in by ambulance from a hotel downtown, alone, no family listed as emergency contact. His cardiac event was serious but not unsurvivable, which I understood, as I worked in the specific clinical way that you understand things. When the understanding is necessary for the decisions you are making, and also in a different way underneath that, the way you understand things that are happening to you personally, rather than to a patient, which I was not allowing myself to access until later. He was stabilized. I handed him to the cardiac team, and I walked to the nurse's station. And I held out my hand for the note. The charge nurse, whose name was Diana, and who had been on my service for 3 years, and who knew me well enough to know that my face was doing something unusual, handed it to me without a word, and then found something to do on the other side of the station. I unfolded the note. It was 2 pages, written front and back, in handwriting that had started steady and gotten less steady as it went, the way handwriting looks when someone is writing something they have been composing in their head for a long time. And the act of putting it down is costing them something. The paper was lined, torn from a notebook, and it had been folded into quarters so many times that the creases were almost separations. The date at the top was 14 months ago. He had written it 14 months ago, and carried it with him, which meant He had been carrying it through whatever the last 14 months of his life had looked like, which I did not yet know and was about to. My mother had told him I was dead, not that I had been taken somewhere. Not that I had wandered off or been found by someone or been placed in foster care, or any of the dozen things that might have happened to a 7-year-old, left on a hospital bench for 2 hours. She had told him, 2 days after my brother was born, that she had found out I had been struck by a car in the hospital parking lot while he was with her during the delivery, and that I had not survived. She had told him this, and he had believed her, and he had gone to pieces in the way that a person goes to pieces when they lose a child, which is not like anything else. The going to pieces had taken years, and the years had taken his marriage, eventually, and he had come out the other side of his grief as a different and diminished version of himself who had spent the following 3 decades carrying the loss of a daughter he believed he had failed by not being there when she needed him. He had not been there. He had been inside the hospital, at my mother's side, during the delivery of my brother, which is where a father is supposed to be. He had trusted that I was safe because he had been told I was safe, because the bench was right outside the doors, because 2 hours in a delivery room felt like nothing when the rest of your attention was consumed by what was happening in the room. He had come out when he could, and I was gone. And my mother had told him the story she had apparently already decided to tell. I do not know why she told him that story. The note did not know either. My father had written that he had asked himself this question for 35 years, and had arrived at different answers at different times, and did not believe he had ever found the right one. What he had found 14 months ago was me. He had found me the way people find things in the age of the internet, which is by searching, which he had been doing periodically for years, with no results, because he had been searching for a child who had supposedly died in 1989, and the search had nowhere to go. What he found 14 months ago was a medical journal article, published under my name, which is his name, which is Mitchell, with a photograph. He had been looking at a photograph of his daughter, whom he believed was dead, standing at a podium at a surgical conference in Chicago, and he had sat with that for 14 months before he had gotten on a plane. He had come to find me. He had not known how to find me beyond showing up in the city where I worked and hoping for something he had not fully planned out, which is not a plan, and which tells you something about the state he was in. He had been in Chicago for 3 days, when his heart had decided to have its own crisis, possibly related to the stress of what he was doing, and possibly simply related to being 68 years old, with a history he outlined briefly in the note, and the ambulance had brought him to Northwestern, because it was the closest hospital. He had given the note to the paramedic in the ambulance, and asked them to make sure the doctor got it. The paramedic had taped it to the chart. The chart had come to me. I stood at the nurse's station with the note in my hands, and I thought about a 7-year-old on a concrete bench, counting cars, and I thought about Carol's thermos and the library book, about horses and the sandwich I had made myself that morning, and I thought about 35 years of him hearing the death of a daughter who was not dead, and I thought about my mother, whom I had not seen since I was 7, and whom I had spent considerable energy over the years not thinking about. And I felt something move through me that I do not have a precise clinical name for, and that I am not going to try to name here. I folded the note. I put it in my pocket. I walked down the hall to the cardiac unit. He was awake. They had told me this before I went in, and I had said I needed a few minutes. And I had stood outside the door of his room for those few minutes doing the thing I had learned to do in residencies, when I had to deliver news that was going to change someone's life, which was to find the still place in myself where the work lived, the place that was steady, regardless of what was happening around it, and operate from there. Then I opened the door. He was propped up in the bed, with leads on his chest, and an IV in his arm, and the oxygen mask replaced by a cannula, and he was looking at the ceiling, with the expression of a man doing an accounting of his life, that he was not sure he was going to finish. He turned his head when I came in. He looked at my face. I watched him see me. Not recognize me, not exactly, because he had never known what I would look like at 42. What he saw was the thing you see when someone's face contains a face you have been carrying for a long time, the specific shock of a version of someone you thought you knew, appearing in a form you were not prepared for. His mouth opened and closed, and his eyes went bright with something that had nothing to do with his cardiac event. I pulled a chair to his bedside and I sat down. "Mr. Mitchell," I said, because I had to start somewhere, and the clinical address was what I had. "I read your note." He made a sound that was not a word. "I'm Sarah," I said. "What happened next took a long time, and I am not going to compress it into something that fits neatly," he cried. "I did not then, not in that room, because the still place was still holding, and I needed it to hold for a little longer." He talked, and I listened, and the story that came out of him across the next 2 hours was a story I had to sit with carefully. The way you sit with something that is true and painful, and that does not resolve into something simple no matter how long you look at it. My father was in the hospital for 4 days. I checked on him every day, not as his surgeon. The cardiac team was managing his care, but as something I did not have a word for yet, something between a stranger and a daughter that we were both figuring out the shape of in real time. He did not ask me for anything. He did not expect forgiveness or reunion or any particular outcome. He had come to find me, because he needed me to know the truth before it was too late, which is what the note had said, and the truth had been told, and what happened next was something neither of us could fully see yet. On the 4th day, before he was discharged, I came to his room, and I sat in the chair by his bed and I said, "I don't know what this is going to be." "Neither do I," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it's something it isn't," I said. "I wouldn't want you to," he said. I looked at him, this man with my nose and my hands, and I thought about the 7-year-old who had packed her own lunch and counted cars and held a library book in her lap and waited for someone to come back. I thought about Carol, complicated and kind and gray, who had sat down on a bench next to a frightened child and made a choice that changed both of their lives. I thought about 3 jobs and medical school, and the still place inside me that had kept me moving through everything. And I understood that the still place had not come from nowhere. It had been built, one decision at a time, by a child who had learned very early that waiting was not a strategy. "I'll call you," I said, "when I'm ready." He nodded. "I'll be there," he said. "When you are." I left the room. I walked down the corridor of the hospital where I was chief of surgery, past the nurse's station where Diana was doing paperwork, past the residents who nodded as I passed, past the rooms full of people whose lives I had been part of at their most critical moments, and I took the elevator down to the lobby and I walked out through the sliding glass doors into the Chicago afternoon. The doors slid closed behind me. I stood on the sidewalk and I thought about another set of sliding glass doors. Samas? In Cincinnati, 35 years ago. And I thought about how long I had been walking away from them. Then I took out my phone and I called Carol. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always did, and I said, I need to tell you something. And she said, I'm here. And I stood on the sidewalk outside Northwestern Memorial, and I told her everything, the way I had always told her things, which was completely and without editing. Because she was the person who had sat down on a bench next to me when I needed someone to sit down, and some debts you do not pay off. You simply carry them forward into everything you become. Tell me what city you are reading this from. I want to know who is out there tonight.